Give Liz some feedback. First thing I wanted to do was talk about what a short sale is. A short sale is simply when a lender is owed a certain amount of money, let's just say $200,000, and the home is only worth $150,000. So somebody's going to have to come up with $50,000, or the bank's going to take a short note or a short sale. There are many ways that the bank handles that deficit. They can give the seller a note. They can let them go scot-free in some cases. Usually if it's an investor, they will not just let an investor off the hook. They're going to want him to sign a note or sign what's called a confession of judgment. And confession of judgment simply means, I know that I owe you $50,000. There's a judgment on my credit report, and it's going to stay there until he settles that judgment. So the thought is, if you get a judgment on your credit, you may be able to sell it for a little bit less than what is actually owed. And I think we'll just jump right into questions. I know that probably sparked many. So I'll take the first question now, Liz.
Okay, Yvonne Smith from Anderson asks, from when the offer first comes in for a potential short sale, when does the earnest money need to be deposited?
That's a great question, because the misconception with the short sale, the buyers always think that they're negotiating or buying it from the bank, and they are not. The seller still holds title to the property. The seller still is the only one that says what can happen with that property. So you negotiate that contract as a normal. The earnest money would need to be deposited on that short sale contract. And of course, it needs to be contingent on lender approving the short sale to seller satisfaction. You don't want to leave that wide open where the seller just has to agree to whatever the bank, whatever terms are put forward. For instance, what if they ask the seller to bring cash to closing and he doesn't have any cash? There's not any way you can do that, but the obligation of that contract still remains. So that's a slippery slope that you need to be careful of, that your seller could get in trouble with because he's obligated to sell that home and could wind up being sued. But if he's in that much trouble, what are they going to sue him for anyway? We don't want that to happen to us either. Next question, Liz.
Another question from Yvonne Smith and Anderson. In multi-offer situations, does the seller only sign and send the best offer to the current lender for review after the seller has signed the offer?
There are a couple different ways to handle that. One school of thought, and I've been to several short sale classes. Liz called me an expert. I'm not. I've just had a little bit of experience and had a lot of training. But one instructor says you never sign the offer. You send all offers to the bank, accept anything but a signed offer. So it kind of goes on what the lender will accept. Also, if you don't sign an offer, then you wouldn't put it as contingent in the computer, and you continue to get offers. That's probably great if you've got a seller, but if you've got a buyer trying to buy a short sale, me personally, I would not put my buyer in that position because they're going to wait around and not get a house potentially. The other thing that I've seen people do, and I'm not recommending you do this, is they sign the offer, hold the offer, send it to the bank, and never give it back to the buyer's agent. So therefore, they've ratified the contract, but the contract is not ratified because they've not delivered it. So it looks like they have to the bank, but the buyer has not received a copy of the contract, so therefore it's not a binding agreement. They can simply just void it and move on.
Okay. Karen Ratchick from my Park Circle office asks, can a homeowner have their home listed at a short sale price and also be trying to get their loan modified at the same time? I was recently told by a seller that a loan modification company, Family Services, told him that that was illegal.
I'm not a lawyer, but I should consult one, especially when the question is put that way. My opinion, though, is that that is not against any law. Many of the banks will not modify a loan if the home is listed for sale, and they may simply request that you take the home off the market. But you know, you put yourself on the banker's side. If they're trying to sell the home, then why would they modify the loan? If I were on the banker's shoes, I'd say, well, why do I do that if you're going to turn around and sell it? You know, there may be some discussion there with the bankers. If you'll modify it, we'll take the home off the market. But as far as breaking a law, I don't think that's illegal.
Yvonne Smith again. If the earnest money gets deposited and the buyer's tired of the wait, right?
That is correct. I mean, you're negotiating with the buyer and seller. All terms of the contract remain between the buyer and the seller. And what I would do is make sure that you use a short sale addendum if you're representing a buyer that says basically they can get their earnest money back at any time or after a certain period of time if they've not gotten an answer from the bank. We have a pretty good short sale addendum that Liz has, and I'm sure she'd be glad to email it out to you. It's the one I use. I'd read it and be familiar with it. It almost is more than an addendum. It's a disclosure of what to expect, and it goes through different aspects of the short sale. But I'm sure Liz will send that out to you. And that, by the way, was drawn up by an attorney.
Okay. Yvonne asks, do most sellers get a 1099 for the loss to the lender?
Yvonne, that's a good question. I'd say not always. It depends on the situation. And what I found is some of the banks in their short sale letter don't address that. But they certainly have the right in any calendar tax year to send your seller a 1099. It's their right because they did take that loss. But they may not do that. But that's where you need to advise them to go talk to their tax accountant as to if they get a 1099, then what will be their tax ramifications.
Question, besides a seller speaking with a tax accountant, what do we as agents need to make a seller aware of regarding any negatives to the seller?
I think if they're behind on their payments, and most of the time it's a requirement of the bank that they be behind on the payments before they'll entertain a short sale, there is some impact to their credit. And, I don't think we know what the long-term impacts are going to be because there are so many short sales, there are so many people delinquent. So only time will really tell. I know that's not a great answer, but I think that's the best answer because time will tell down the road what the impact's going to be for these people. If the banks don't have some leniency in this particular window of time, then it's going to be tough for us to do business moving forward because we will have taken a lot of potential buyers of homes out of the equation. So the answer to your buyer is, I think, is you don't know exactly what it is. I think it's going to have some impact. And this question may not come up, but one of the points I'm going to go ahead and make here is if you're a seller and that they get a foreclosure notice of a hearing, they want to make sure they get in touch with that attorney and answer that hearing date, because many times they'll put that hearing off if they know the seller's communicating. That's point one. Point two is if they get that notice of hearing and they have the hearing, that is actually like a trial. And so what that does, when they have that hearing and go to trial, they're basically going to be found guilty because the bank's going to show up with their paperwork and their attorney, and then when the judge says guilty, that person then has a foreclosure whether you close it under the terms of the short sale or not. So what I'm speaking of, there's always a 30 or 60 or 90-day window when the hearing takes place and it's for sale on the courthouse steps. You really need your seller to be clear that their credit may show a foreclosure, even though they're going to say, well, I sold the home. That's where they probably need some advice from an attorney to tell them what that impact is. I don't think you can advise them on that. Next question.
I think you addressed this a little earlier, but do most sellers get a loss?
I'd say most do. Most do, not always. It depends on who the final investor is. And the person that you're negotiating with on a short sale, whether it be Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they may be the servicer of the loan. They may not be the final holder or the investor in the loan. So that person that's going to determine that is going to be the investor. The investor is an insurance company, for example, and they did own a lot of loans. If that insurance company's in trouble or defunct or gone and somebody bought the debt, they may just say, I want to get all I can out of it. I'm not going to worry about chasing you down the road, and simply let you go. That's not what happens always, but that can happen. Also, another thing, this question will probably come up, they may ask the seller to sign a note for the difference and make payments towards that note. But only your seller can determine what they're comfortable doing. I think you can help them with that some, but I really think having them go to an attorney and talk about it and talk through it and a tax accountant is very important.
Okay. Danny Patrick from Goose Creek has left, but he did ask a question. How long will a short sale prevent a seller from purchasing a new home?
That's a great question that I can't answer. One, it depends on if they actually got to the courthouse steps, had that foreclosure, how long the short sale took, because if it took 18 months, then they're basically going to have 18 months worth of late payment history on their credit report. That's why I say this window of time is going to have to be evaluated down the road by lenders, and I'm sure there'll be lenders eventually that spring up out of the woodwork and do secondary lending, like we saw probably 10 years ago. We had a secondary market, and say if your market rate was at 6%, there may be investors out there willing to take that loan or that paper at 8 or 9% because of what happened in this window of time. They're not anxious to do that now. I think everybody's in the wait and see as far as what's going to happen. But I think there'll be some investment opportunity on the lending side when people start lending money again. Okay.
Andrea Rogers from Johnny Dodds asked, what is the determining sales price on a courthouse sale?
What happens on the courthouse steps is it's an interesting process. The value is usually determined by what's owed to the lender. So the lender show up, his attorney, or by phone have a bid in on the property, because the lender is better off bidding what's owed to them to get the property back versus letting it sell on the courthouse steps. And many times it will sell on the courthouse steps, and it will sell for less than what's owed, and there may be a deficiency that's sought against the borrower. So two ways things can be sold on the courthouse steps. They can be sold that day to the highest bidder. The bank will typically bid as well, and then it goes back to the bank or goes to the buyer. The other thing that happens is on that first day, they can say that they're seeking a deficiency judgment, and then if the bank will bid it, and then really nobody's going to bid on it if they're seeking deficiency, if they know what they're doing, because it will come up again in 30 days, and then it will really be for sale and be able to be bought. And the bank will typically bid on it again or have a bid, and then you can go to the courthouse steps and buy it. There's really not a good way for agents to be involved in that. I don't think you should. There's a lot of risk. Not every lien on a transaction goes away, and you would want to do a title search on the property before you bid. You would also want to inspect the property. I won't do this too often, but I'll give you Charlotte that went down and bid on the property on the courthouse steps, checked it the morning of the auction. He went back after he bought it, and all the cabinets and light fixtures were gone. So the seller, or the person that lost the house, was bitter and angry and did that. And he ended up not buying the property, but he had to pay to remarket it, and it cost him about $3,000 to get out of the deal. So next question.
Actually, that's all the questions. So,
well, I'll jump into one aspect of the short sale, and I created a list, I guess, almost 2 years ago, and sent it to Liz. Liz has added some questions to it, but I think I titled it "What Agents Should Be Asking," and asking sellers when they go on a property interview, especially in this time. And I don't think you do it just when it's a short sale, but we've got to ask these sellers how much do you own the property, determine the values, see if they're upside down in it. But you know, a lot of those things, and we'll go through them if I can get that list up, that you want to ask is, you know, do you have any tax liens? Person's got a tax lien. You may have a problem selling it if there's not going to be enough funds to pay that tax lien. Another thing people overlook are judgments. If a seller has a judgment, it could be against anything. They could have had an automobile accident and been sued and had a judgment against them. It attaches to that property. It's not exactly the same thing as a lien, but it acts like a lien, and that would need to be settled before that transaction can close. It could have happened on another piece of property. What you always need to do in processing short sales, you're going to need it anyway, is hire an attorney to put together a mock cut. But I strongly recommend you check that title and get a title search done, and they will search for judgments against the seller before you submit that to the bank. And I learned that lesson the hard way. I had a seller, he didn't know he had a judgment. He had a judgment for some countertops that were installed. Guess who got to pay $5,000 for countertops because I needed it to close. Luckily, it was a $15,000 condition, and it made sense for me to do it. It was a good business decision, in my opinion, to do that. But had we done a title search first, we could have placed that $5,000 on the HUD and possibly gotten the short sale approved with that on there. But the way it wound up, we were a little bit too late.
Okay, what if they owe more money on the property? The seller owes more money on the property than the property's worth. Then what?
Well, it depends on if the seller has money. The banks are going to be looking for funds. If that seller has savings and can pay the difference, then he better be prepared to bring that money to the closing table because he's not going to get a short sale approved. The other thing banks look at, and they do this forensically, they hire people to do this. They look at sellers' assets. They will find 401ks. They will ask you to close that 401k. They don't care if you got to pay a penalty and the income tax on it. They want you to bring funds to closing. Now, a seller has the right to say no. It's negotiable with the bank. But if they see those funds, they are certainly going to ask for them. And that kind of brings up a point. make sure your seller is being honest with you and giving you honest, straightforward answers, or walk away from the deal. I mean, if they're not and they're trying to hide money and they've got other properties, other investments, just get away from them. They're trying to do something they're not supposed to do.
I have another question from Kim Peasley Parker in Sumter. Is there a good source to locate possible short sales?
You can sign up for some services on the internet like Realty Track. That will tell you when there's delinquency, and it gives you the property address, and then as you know, it's just a matter of time. I mean, a matter of going to the courthouse and for your tax records and looking up the owner and contacting them.
Okay, one thing I'd like to say about that, you said, what did you say, Real Tracks, or what did you say?
Realty Track, I believe is the name.
Realty Track?
Yeah, I'll try to get the link and send it to you.
Okay. And I have another question from Andrea Rogers. Can the seller, this is good, all of them are good, but can the seller sign 2 different offers and then submit them to the bank for the final decision by the bank?
That is a great question. And that is up to your broker. But I believe your broker's answer is this. As long as your contract is written where it is based on third-party approval, then I think you're pretty safe in doing that. But normally you would never sign 2 or 3 offers on a property. But on a short sale case, as long as the contract is written correctly and your seller and you put in there that you have to agree to the bank's terms, then I think, yes, you can. Now, the slippery slope there is what's the other agent going to think of you. If they've written their contract correctly, they're probably going to walk away. You know, one of the things that, and I see this almost every time, some of the agents understand that, a lot of them don't. They think they're buying the property from the bank because it's a short sale, and they are not. They are buying it from that seller. Then it is up to the seller to go negotiate with the bank.
Stan, if I could interject right there, and I get this question a lot from the agent owners in the office. They'll say, well, you know, I want the listing agent says we have to go directly to the bank and the seller doesn't have to sign the contract. And then they ask, well, when is the contract ratified and when do I have to turn the earnest money in? As Stan just said, the seller is the one selling the house. They have to get the approval from the lender, but they are selling the house. So the seller signs a contract, and then you have a ratified contract, right, Stan?
That is correct. And then the earnest money, per the terms of the contract, would need to be deposited. I suppose you could do some addendum that says earnest money after a certain amount of days, earnest money after full bank approval. But I think it's better. It's better for your seller. I mean, it depends on which side you're on. If you're holding some money and holding some people to the deal.
Okay, another question is, will the lender repairs or inspections or warranties or anything like that on the short sale?
Typically, I'm going to say no. Now, that's where doing a good job on that HUD up front can help get some of those things approved, because some will pay for warranties, some will not. Some will pay X amount of repairs, so it's probably a good idea to put that on the HUD. Go ahead and put the warranty, go ahead and put, and the bank's going to come back and say what they'll pay for. You know, this question was not asked, but a little bit about price. What I'm seeing out there is when somebody submits an offer and it's lower than what the seller wants, the agent, the buyer's agent, will says, well, just send it to the bank, let's see what happens. And you can do that for sure, but many times what the buyer, once they've signed that agreement, they have that price in their head. So they think, well, I'm going to get it for this price because we've submitted it to the bank. And then when the bank counters the offer because it's too low, they just simply walk away. So you've wasted your time. I get what I call a fair offer, and basically look at your comps. And this is, you don't ever know what the number is going to be. Again, it depends on the investor. But if you look at market value, I would say the net to the bank is going to be anywhere from 5 to 15% below that. And you can get deals for less than that, but the chances of you getting a house at 50 cents on the dollar, it's just not going to happen. So negotiate that contract up, or just get the next buyer. Because you don't want to waste your time with somebody that's going to probably just walk away from you that's going to try to steal something.
I've got another good question. Does the lender have the authority to cut my commission once the seller has agreed to a contract already with paying me 6% or whatever? Can the bank cut my commission?
The bank can certainly say that, but the final decision is up to the agent, because the listing agreement is where the commission is dealt with, and that is between the listing agent and the seller. And many times the bank recognizes that as a binding contract and will not try to negotiate commissions. They did early on. They're starting to get better about not doing that. They may simply give you a bottom line number that you have to back into that requires you to negotiate your commission. And I always put in the listing that the commission is negotiable, and that by submitting an offer, the co-op agent is going to negotiate their necessary. That's going to be in the agent notes on all my listings, because I don't want to have to pay, if we're $500 apart and we're both making a good commission, I don't want to pay the whole $500. I'm disclosing to that other agent that, hey, you're splitting this with me right up front. And they know it, and I've had very little pushback from agents. But, man, try messing with somebody's money or the honey, right? Doesn't boys always say that, Liz?
That's right. Never mess with anybody's money or that honey. Another thing is, do all sellers qualify for a short sale? I mean, can they make too much money? Can they make not enough money?
No, not all sellers will qualify for a short sale. Communication is going to be key with the bank, and your seller being upfront about assets and income will also help you a lot. Now, then the bank will look at certain situations like a job transfer. A lot of times, if somebody's transferred out of the area and the market value has dropped, the bank may negotiate with you to take a note. And that's still a short sale. Sometimes that's easier if you go to your bank and say, look, I'm making a job transfer. I'm not going to be able to maintain 2 households. You can negotiate with them up front usually that, hey, I'm going to pay you, but let me pay you a note. If the guy's got a $3,000 house payment in Mount Pleasant and he transfers to New Jersey, it may make sense for him to pay a $500 a month note on that short sale, or do go ahead and buy another house in New Jersey or wherever he's going.
Another thing that has come up a good bit in this office is if the seller has accepted the contract, but the bank is requiring that the listing agent and the seller continue to take offers until closing. What about that? That's weird.
Well, I think they could probably ask that, but there again, it goes back to your listing agreement, in my opinion. You're welcome to jump in here, Liz. But if you're holding that property as active contingent, and our board does require that, if you ratify a contract, you're going to have to put in our MLS. I don't know how Sumter is and Manning and some of the other places, but you are going to have to put that as contingent and spell out what the contingency is. And I think you've got some duty to your seller to present the offer in the listing agreement, and then they can decide whether they want you to present it to the bank or not. I don't think the bank out of hand can require you to do that.
Have you seen where, oh, I'm sorry, I have another question over here. I've been coming up with questions, but Andrea says, Edgar Rogers, what kind of risk is involved in us agents actually negotiating payoffs of liens on behalf of the seller?
I think that's a good question. I don't think, I mean, the risk is on the other side, if you're telling the other agent you can get a deal done and you can't, then you may have an upset buyer. I don't think there's a lot of risk as long as your seller has given you permission to negotiate, and that is one of the things that you're going to need to submit to everybody you talk to. You're going to need a third-party authorization. Your seller needs to give you permission to talk to his bank and negotiate with them and all the other lenders. Most of the time, if you're negotiating a judgment or a lien, you're probably going to be talking to another attorney, not that person specifically. You may talk to them if they're a bank, but many times if it's a judgment, you're going to want to go back to the attorney that filed the judgment. That would be like on a bad debt, like if a countertop wasn't paid for. And many times they'll settle for less, sometimes they won't. But you have to work through that process. But I don't think you've got a lot of liability. Your choice is you could throw your hands up, walk away. If you do that, you're probably never going to get a paycheck from that seller, which also may be wasting a lot of time.
Okay, thank you. Jackie Lawson from Goose Creek. If a seller has an FHA loan, is it true that the bank can only pay 1% toward the buyer's closing cost if the bank, in fact, would have paid 3% closing costs on the offer?
I think, I'm not real sure about that. I got somebody I can ask that question to. I think they can still pay 3%. It all comes down to that net sales price or that net amount the FHA is going to receive. Because FHA is an insurer, they're not the lender. So the lender may have a rule against it, but the FHA is basically insuring the loan. And there are a couple, when you're doing an FHA, there's a couple extra steps that you have to get approval for. But the good thing, when you get an FHA loan approved, even if you lose your buyer, most of the time that number that is negotiated is good for a period of up to 6 months. One of the things that they'll do on an FHA loan is they'll pay the seller $1,000 to move, or just basically out of goodwill to kind of help the seller. So that was part of the, I think Bush passed it right before he went out of office, and I don't know the letters for it, but there is a little bit of cash there. Many times what you're going to have to do with that is the seller's really not going to get it because if they're not paying their house payments, they probably have to pay the HOA dues, and there's other things that money will get used for. But, in some cases they have paid their dues or whatever, and so they will get the $1,000.
Okay. Have you had many short sales that were not as-is condition?
I have had a few, but there again, that's where it's important to put that on the HUD. I've had some short sales where they were under construction and didn't have a CO, and so I was able to get the CO, but I had to spend about $2,000 to get the CO to make the house ready to sell. So what we simply did before we ever submitted the offer was put those costs on the HUD, explain to the lender we did not have a CO and the home could not be occupied, nor could the borrower get a loan unless we had a CO. So they were willing to do that and did that. I'd say each case is probably different, but the more accurate information you get on that HUD statement up front, then the better off you are. If you can get, if you're representing the seller and you can get the buyer's agent to agree to go ahead and do the home inspection and remove that contingency, I think you're ahead of the game.
Okay, anybody else have any questions out there? I think, Stan, earlier you addressed this, I know you addressed this, but if a seller, if it's a short sale situation, and the seller has other liens at the bank, at the courthouse, for maybe a roofer that did roofing work and didn't get paid and whatever. You kind of addressed this earlier, but could you address that again and tell us what's the risk for us, for our agent owners, in dealing with this?
Well, I mean, the risk is you might do a lot of work and not get paid. I think it's your biggest risk because it will be a lot of work. And Andrea asked that question earlier. She's got one that they've got about 7 different situations on. I think she's gotten answers from some of them that, based on the fact that this seller was not going to make any money or had no funds coming back to them on the sale, they would consider releasing the lien. And that's what you want, a lien release. Or you either have to settle the judgment. It's 2 different things, but they are essentially the same. You could settle a $3,000 judgment for $500 sometimes. Sometimes you can't. You're not, on the judgment, you may have to you can't do a partial release. It's either all or nothing a lot of times. So you may just simply have to pay that judgment, and hopefully those won't be too big. But unless it's a deficiency judgment. There's a mechanics lien, which may be something, as Liz said, that the roofer didn't get paid. The roofer may be perfectly willing to get something out of it if he's owed $3,000 or $4,000, and you'll give him $1,000 on the hood, just so he got something out of it. He may not be. It's all negotiable. It depends on every situation on a short sale. I can promise you there's no cookie cutter. They're never all the same because there is always a different negotiator on the other end that's going to ask your seller for something. So it's going to be different every time you do it. There's not going to be a set thing, this is what I do.
You know, another thing that comes up, if you have a buyer, and the buyer, well, let's say this, what type of buyer do you think would be ideal for a short sale? And what type of buyer should you not even think about short sale?
I think first-time buyers don't always understand, not that you can't do it, but every situation there again is different. If the person, first-time buyer for instance, is living with mom and dad and they don't care that it takes a year to get a house, that's the house they want, and they want a good deal, then I think it might be a good fit. But that's where you also need to do an intake with that buyer, make them fully aware of what they're getting into, that you could spend 6, 7, 8, 9 months, a year on this thing and still not close. The danger is you can get to the day of closing and the thing fall apart. The lender doesn't have to agree even after they agree, because you know it's the old saying, the golden rule, who has the gold makes the rules. Well, as we all know, the bank can change the rules. What if the bank goes under, I mean, anything can happen. We've seen that happen, where closings were at the closing table and the FDIC came in and took over the bank. And it not only killed the deal, it's going to shut it down. So anything can happen, and I think that's an important thing. As a buyer of a short sale property, has got to realize I may not get this. They're probably not going to lose their earnest money, but they may have some expense as far as a title search, attorney fee, home inspection, and their time and your time without getting to a closing. There are many, many good deals out there that are short sales. I wouldn't be scared of them because, let's face it, folks, we got to deal with this probably for the next 2 years and maybe longer.
We have another question from Yvonne. Was there a recent change requiring lenders to respond within 30 days from receipt of the short sale offer?
No, I don't. Not that I'm aware of. You may want to get on the internet and do a little research on that yourself, because a lender's response time is going to be based on what the seller gives them. In other words, if the seller has not provided them all the documentation, or they need something else to make a decision, or they do the forensic evaluation and hide in the IRA, then it's going to take more than 30 days. So I don't think that's true. Please correct me if somebody out there finds a different answer.
Okay, anybody else have a question? I don't see any else typed up there yet. I'm trying to see what else I can trip Stan on.
There's probably a lot. But, you know, that's the important thing on buyer and seller, is do your interview process correctly. Sit down and make yourself a list of questions, and try not to get caught with that seller or that buyer without knowing exactly what they're getting into.
All right, let's spend a few minutes, Stan, and just go through a list of questions that we have come up with. I will leave you off the screen. These are the questions Stan was alluding to earlier. When you go to talk to a seller and it's a potential short sale, one question you want to ask them?
Of course, how much do you own on the property? Because, you know, I'm sure you've done your homework before you go on a listing appointment, and you know what the house is worth. So you can have a red flag immediately. Always ask if there's a second, third, or fourth mortgage. How many mortgages do you have? Liens or judgments against you. Some people may be offended, but you just have to explain to them what's going on out there. Hey, this is not on the questions or part of this, but you know, one thing you got to really be careful to is vacant houses that are for rent, and I'm sure you can speak to this. There are people that are putting short sale contracts on vacant properties, turn it around and rent them out. They don't really care whether the short sale gets approved or not, because they're collecting money every month. Don't let your sellers get into that. Another thing that we're seeing out there in the market is there are quote-unquote investors that want you to deed your seller's property over to them. As a realtor, I don't really think you need to get involved in that. I would not do it. If you're not clear on what I'm saying, you have a short sale listing, a guy calls you and says, I'm an investor, I'll buy the property. I want to meet with your seller and have them sign a deed over to me for nothing. And it's a quit claim deed in many instances. Then he wants to go to the bank and negotiate as the owner. And don't do that. I mean, I just don't think you need to get involved in it.
Please don't do that.
I think there's some legal ramifications that people they're not considering. I think that there are some people that are doing that are going to get in some serious trouble eventually. The investor, he doesn't have a license to lose, you do. And the hook for those guys, many of them will tell you, oh, we're going to pay you a full commission if we get the deal done, and then we'll turn around and list the house with you after we get the short sale approved. So, you know, it's a slippery slope to deal with those kind of guys.
We'll get back to the questions in just a minute, but Kim Peasley is asking, do you approach homeowners with short sale, or do you let them approach you?
I usually let them approach me. I don't market to them specifically. It's something that I've considered. I think there's a business model for that, a place to do that. You know, if you're certainly aggressive and want to go after the business, and oddly enough, you know, a lot of the business I get on short sales is really from other realtors that don't want to do it. So And I would tell you to do that. I'm not saying refer the business to me, but if you don't have the stomach or the time for it, then give it to somebody that can do it. And that was one of the things the instructor in one of the classes told us. And after hearing everything that she presented and what can go on and how much work it would take, I've had some of those same people in that class call me and say, "You want this deal? I don't want to do it."
I know we have one of the very successful agent owners in this office that took the 2-week course and now will not touch them because she's afraid of the liability.
Right, and there is a lot of liability there. You know, people get upset in a deal, and that's, again, buyers and sellers need to be educated. And, you know, the other agent on the other side, if you don't feel like they know what they're doing and they're educating their buyer or their seller, then you might want to move on. I mean, if you call a listing agent and they say they've got a short sale, ask them some questions. For one, there's third-party negotiators, and I've used them. I don't see anything wrong with that. You know, make sure they're doing everything they're going to do. Make sure that they don't have what they call a frozen seller. In other words, if the seller's not willing to cooperate and they're just sitting there kind of going through the motions and they're not going to give tax returns and everything that the bank requires or pay stubs or whatever it takes, then you're probably better off moving on to the next seller, somebody that's motivated to do the deal.
The next question was brought up by Claire Lewis of Isle Palms, and I think Claire, to answer her question, she's saying, address the importance of an agent not being nervous to ask the seller the right questions. A lot of listing agents are nervous, and a group of us put together this group of questions, and it can be added to later, but I'm going to go through them. Oh, I just went back. You want to ask them, the sellers, how much do you own the property? Do you have a second, a third mortgage, or fourth? Who is your lender, or who are your lenders? Ask if they will complete the form allowing you to get the payoff information, and you should have a form to get their loan number and all of those kinds of things. Ask if they owe more than the property is worth. Excuse me, if they owe more than the property is worth, then you may want to ask them these questions. Have you talked to your lender about a short sale? Is this home in foreclosure or pre-foreclosure?
If they don't understand that, the best way to ask them that is are they making their payments on time every month? Are they behind? My opinion is if they're 30 or 60 days behind, they probably are in pre-foreclosure.
Ask them, do you understand that the lender may 1099 you or place a deficient judgment against you? Have you talked to your tax advisor and your attorney? Are there any pending lawsuits or judgments against you on this property? Do you have any personal tax liens? Have the property taxes been paid? I know some of you are thinking, well, these are real personal questions, but these are questions you need to know the answers to if you're going to list a short sale. Have you filed for bankruptcy and has it been discharged? If so, please give me a copy of the discharge order. If you're in bankruptcy, contact your attorney before we list the property. Then have your attorney contact me or your listing agent. We receive an offer. The lender will require, I'm going to have to get out of this now because I went across the screen. If you receive, and I have copies of this, and if you all would like them, I'll be glad to get them to everybody that is here on the webinar today. Once we receive an offer, the lender will require a lot of information to complete the sale. Will you cooperate and diligently supply all needed information? And then once you need to ask to the seller, you need to tell the seller, as real estate professionals, we are here to get you this property sold. We cannot give you legal advice or tell you what your credit or tax consequences are. Please seek advice from your attorney, CPA, financial advisor, or tax advisor. These are just some simple questions. I'm sure everybody can add to them, but don't be afraid to ask those questions. If you're afraid to ask those questions, then you shouldn't be listing a short sale.
The thing you really need to do is you need the information, and when you go in and interview that seller, if they quit taking care of the house and they're behind and they've got a foreclosure hearing notice, maybe they're a year or two behind, then you're really probably too late. You should probably just try to move on. You could refer them to Try United Way, and I strongly recommend you do that. They'll try to do some things to help them. But one of the things they can work on with their lender is called forbearance. And forbearance is a certain period of time. It's usually 90 days, 120 days, where they kind of leave them alone, say, okay, quit making your payment. We'll tack it on the back. It's negotiable as how they handle that, and kind of see what you're doing. Forbearance, what you want to do in any situation, we all want to make money, but stop and consider not only how to save the sale, but how to save the person. Sometimes that's important. If somebody is 6 months behind and they haven't talked to their bank, encourage them to talk to the bank. Communication is going to be the key. If they can get forbearance, their situation could drastically change in 3 or 4 months, and they may be able to go back to that lender and catch their payments up and negotiate it. And you know what? That's great. Somebody got to stay in their home. That's not a bad thing.
We have another question. Andrea Rogers asked, does the length of time to close depend mostly on the cooperation with the primary lien holder?
Yeah, because your primary is gonna set the timeline. Let me speak to that a little bit, because they're going to give you an approval letter. That approval letter is for a specific time. It's got to be done before X date or so many days from receipt and sign the letter, and then they're going to send that letter back. But the thing that will happen a lot of times, that's why you want to have these other secondary liens lined up and put on the HUD exactly what the lender is approving, and then you got 30 days to close. And most of them are giving you 30 days to close. I have had the situation where it was a Bank of America, not picking on Bank of America, this is just what happened. We worked for 7 months to get it approved. I had the buyer, the seller was a realtor. He was on top of it, called the bank every day. My buyer came up towards the end of it, could get financing. We had to seek other financing. So what the bank actually asked for was a $100 a day penalty. And guess who paid the penalty that time? I did on that one too. But again, it made good business to me to do it. The buyer could not do it because they were close on their funds on getting the approval. We were probably about 2 weeks late getting it closed, but we got it closed. And the bank ended up working with us, but we did have to pay that $100 a day. So make sure on that side of it, you know what the seller's agreement and what the terms are of that agreement, because it could affect the buyer, because the seller's probably not got any money.
We've got 2 more questions, and the time is running out. Steve Kugelman wants to know, what are some examples of potential liabilities an agent could be faced with?
Well, I think the biggest liability is somebody's disappointed because they don't get a property, and then everybody likes to sue the realtor. So you could be sued and the seller could be sued because they've entered into a contract they can't perform on. That's why that addendum and those contingencies are so important. And this is a litigious business. Liz will testify to this in court, that you don't have to have done anything wrong for somebody to sue you. It happens all the time.
because people, most of the time, because they get their feelings hurt. They find that house and they're emotionally attached to it and then find out they can't get it, then there could be some anger and they could come after you. So that's your biggest liability. Also, the other side of that is if you told the seller you could, if you emphatically said, I can get the short sale approved in X amount of days, I can get you out of here, there's not going to be any ding on your credit, you can go buy a house in 2 years, then you've opened yourself up to the liability. So as long as you're careful and manage what you say, then I think you'll be fine.
Okay, Andrew Rogers says, all these questions, how can we advise and handhold them, I guess you mean the buyers, through the process? What is the step-by-step process for these people, and where do we start?
Well, I think the important thing we keep alluding to is that intake form. Ask all those questions, and then advise them to go to attorneys, CPAs.
This is for the seller.
To get advice for the seller. As far as the buyer, Liz will send you that addendum. Read it carefully, and that addendum actually spells out to the buyer some of the pitfalls and some of the things you can get into. If you're working with the buyer, I would say have the conversation that is on the brink of discouraging them at all from doing a short sale. Have a good, frank conversation with them. And, for risk management purposes, it wouldn't hurt to have them sign a document that says, you've been informed. I've told you this, this, and this, and go down the list. Let them know that this may not close, that it's not guaranteed.
How can we advise and handhold them, I guess you mean the buyers, through the process? What is the step-by-step process for these people, and where do we start?
Well, I think the important thing we keep alluding to is that intake form. Ask all those questions, and then advise them to go to attorneys, CPAs.
This is for the seller.
To get advice for the seller. As far as the buyer, Liz will send you that addendum. Read it carefully, and that addendum actually spells out to the buyer some of the pitfalls and some of the things you can get into. If you're working with the buyer, I would say have the conversation that is on the brink of discouraging them at all from doing a short sale. Have a good, frank conversation with them. And, for risk management purposes, it wouldn't hurt to have them sign a document that says, you've been informed. I've told you this, this, and this, and go down the list. Let them know that this may not close, that it's not guaranteed.